Hello, this is Ian Murphy. Today we'll be reading A History of Central Banking by Stephen Goodson. We've reached chapter 3, or chapter 4, I should say. Alright, let's begin. Chapter 4. A Century of Struggle. Rothschild versus the People. Quote, "Who hold the balance of the world, who reign o'er Congress, whether royalist or liberal, who rouse the shirtless patriots of Spain, that make old Europe's journal squeak and gibber, who keep the world, both old and new, in pain or pleasure, who make politics run glibber all, the shade of Bonaparte's noble daring, Jew Rothschild and his fellow Christian bearing." End quote. Lord Byron, 12th Canto. Central banking in the United States. As this section will show, all previous encounters which the United States has experienced with central banking have been very negative. During the colonial period, the American colonies created their own paper money. The first colony to do so was Massachusetts in 1691. Pennsylvania, New York, Delaware, and Maryland soon followed suit. They called their currency colonial script or bills of credit. It freed them from the control of the English banks and enabled them to run their financial affairs in an inflation-free environment with few taxes. Throughout the colonies, sustained, stable economic growth and prosperity were achieved, which would not have been possible under a privately run banking system based on usury. In 1763, American statesman Benjamin Franklin, 1706 through 1790, visited London, where he was shocked to observe slum conditions and the wide prevalence of poverty. When the British Parliament asked Franklin to explain the source of prosperity of the American colonies, he replied as follows, quote, "That is simple. In the colonies, we issue our own money. It is called colonial script. We issue it in the proportion to the demands of trade and industry, to make the products pass easily from the producers to the consumers. In this manner, creating for ourselves our own money, we control its purchasing power, and we have no interest to pay anyone." End quote. The following year, in 1764, the Bank of England introduced a currency bill which severely restricted the colonies' right to issue their own money and forbade its legal tender status for the payment of private and public debts. Instead, the bank ordered them to issue bonds at interest and sell them to the Bank of England in exchange for English money. In the event only half of the currency was remitted. As a consequence of this law, the economy of the colonies collapsed, and within 1 year, more than half the population became unemployed and destitute. The Stamp Act of 1765 was the last straw, but the abolition of the colonial currency was the primary cause of the revolution. One of the first tasks entrusted to the Second Continental Congress, which convened for the first time on May 10, 1775, was to issue its own currency, largely to finance its war expenditures. A total of $241,552,788 was issued during the currency's existence. The Bank of England quickly responded. Hundreds of workmen were recruited, and soon millions of dollars worth of counterfeit banknotes were rolling off the printing press and being shipped to New York. The Continental dollar retained much of its purchasing power during the first 2 years of its issuance, but once the English counterfeit banknotes started to increase in circulation, its value soon fell away, and by 1780, $1 was worth only 2.5 cents. 15 years later, in 1790, the Bank of England mounted another similar operation when it employed over 400 workmen in 17 factories in southern and central England to print the assignat, which had the currency of revolutionary France. The assignat, which was backed by clerical lands, was in its initial stages and successfully circulated as a means of exchange, and a significant portion of the national debt was repaid. However, By 1792, the massive infusion of counterfeit notes soon caused the assignat to plummet in value, and thereafter there was a brief period of hyperinflation. On April 14, 1803, Napoleon Bonaparte introduced the government-issued franc, which acquired the status of legal tender in 1808. Already in 1781, before the conclusion of the War of Independence on April 11, 1783, Robert Morris, 1734 through 1806, the Superintendent of Finance, introduced a bill which restored the new state to servitude with the establishment of the Bank of North America. This bank commenced operations on January 4th, 1782. It attracted large deposits of silver and gold coin and bills of exchange obtained through loans from France and the Netherlands, which enabled it to issue paper currency on the strength of these reserves. Between 1791 and 1796, inflation surged by 72%. In 1795, the state of Pennsylvania withdrew its jurisdiction on account of, quote, alarming foreign influence and fictitious credit, end quote. On February 25th, 1791, the Bank of North America was succeeded by a second central bank, which was chartered as the first bank of the United States. It was imposed as a result of the intrigues of Alexander Hamilton, the Secretary of the Treasury, whose actions indicate that he was working hand in glove with the directors of the Bank of England, as it was modeled on the bank. The new bank had a capital of $10 million, of which 20% was held by the U.S. government and the balance of private investors. The bank was strongly opposed by future presidents John Adams, James Madison, and Thomas Jefferson, then Secretary of State, who would later state that, quote, the central bank is an institution of the most deadly hostility existing against the principles and form of our Constitution. I believe that the banking institutions are more dangerous to our liberties than standing armies. Already they have raised up a money-eyed aristocracy that has set the government at defiance. The issuing power should be taken from the banks and restored to the people to whom it properly belongs. If the American people ever allow the banks to control the issuance of their currency, first by inflation and then by deflation, the banks and corporations that grow up around them will deprive the people of all property until their children will wake up homeless on the continent their fathers occupied. End quote. The following year, the bank organized the first crash known as the Panic of 1792 by flooding the market with cheap loans and suddenly calling most of them in. The bank precipitated a 25% plunge in the price of 6% treasury bonds, which resulted in financial chaos. By the end of 1795, the bank had lent $6 million to government, or 60% of its capital, as the bank was allegedly concerned with the stability of government finances. It demanded partial repayment of this loan. The government did not have the funds available and was therefore forced to sell its shareholdings in the bank between the years 1796 and 1802. By means of this cunning ruse, the bank became 100% privately owned, of which 75% of the shares were held by foreigners. In 1811, the bank's charter came up for renewal. The bank was concealing its profits, operating in a clandestine manner, and was believed to be unconstitutional. It was designed primarily to serve the business interests of the North at the expense of the agricultural development of the South, while the Democrats and Republicans, Jeffersonians, wanted to abolish it. Former President Thomas Jefferson was still one of those who violently opposed renewal of the bill. What particularly irked the legislators was the fact that the bank was now 100% in the ownership of foreigners. The press variously described the central bank bill as a great swindle, a vulture, a viper, and a cobra. Furthermore, they contended that it was the constitutional right of Congress to regulate weights and measures and issue coined money. The bill was defeated by a wafer-thin margin of 65 to 64 votes, which was an achievement as there is a strong likelihood that many of the yes votes were bought. On March 3, 1811, the bank finally closed its doors. When the principal shareholder of the First Bank of the United States, Mayer Amschel Rothschild, heard about the deep dissension regarding the renewal of the bank's charter, he flew into a rage and declared that, quote, either the application for renewal of the charter is granted, or the United States will find itself involved in a most disastrous war, end quote. He also said that, quote, I will teach those impudent Americans a lesson and bring them back to colonial status, end quote. Rothschild tried to influence the British Prime Minister Spencer Perceval into declaring war on the United States in order to resurrect his privately owned central bank. In 1807, Perceval joined the cabinet as Chancellor of the Exchequer. At the time, England was at war with France, and one of his principal tasks was to raise money in order to finance the war. Instead of increasing taxes, he raised a number of loans, initially from bearing banks, and thereafter mainly from the Rothschilds. Perceval's secretary was John Charles Harris, who had been appointed to that position 5 years previously. Harris was an inmate of Nathan Rothschild, and until his death in 1858, faithfully served the Rothschild cause in the various positions he held in the British government as First Lord of the Treasury, Commissary General to the Army, and Chancellor to the Exchequer. Meanwhile, provocateurs were stoking up discontent in North America in order to provoke the Americans. The British started to interfere with U.S. trade with France, which had imposed a continental blockade against England. As the Royal Navy was short of sailors, they engaged in forced recruitment or impressment of American sailors. They also supplied the Indian tribes, and in particular, the Shawnee chief Tushsek, with arms in order to frustrate the curtail the settlers' westward expansion. Concurrently, Perceval was facing increased pressure from Nathan Rothschild to make a declaration of war on the United States. He refused. The British army was already bogged down in a stalemate situation in Spain and Portugal, the Peninsular War of 1808 through 1814, with Napoleon's forces, and he had no desire to commit more troops and treasure financed by more interest-bearing bank loans, simply in order to save the Rothschilds' sinking banking interests in America. The assassin of Spencer Perceval, John Bellingham, was born about 1769 in St. Neots, Huntingdonshire. From 1800 through 1802, he worked at Archjexel as an agent for imports and exporters. He returned to Russia in 1804, and in November of that year, he was falsely accused of having reneged on a debt of 4,890 rubles, which subsequently led to his imprisonment for 4 years. On his release, Bellingham took up residence in Duke Street, Liverpool. He unsuccessfully petitioned the government for compensation. Bellingham, a bitter and aggrieved man, fell into company with two dissolute American merchants, Thomas Wilson and Elisha Peck, who were both keen to have orders in council which forbade neutral nations from trading with France abrogated. These orders in council had been introduced by Perceval in response to Napoleon's continental blockade, which the latter had instituted in 1806 and prohibited trade with Britain and Ireland. Their continuation was due to be debated in Parliament on that fateful evening. At 5:15 p.m. on May 11, 1812, as Perceval entered the lobby of the House of Commons, Bellingham stepped forward and shot him in the heart. Perceval collapsed, uttering, quote, "Murder, oh my God," and, quote, and within minutes was dead. 4 days later, Bellingham was put on trial at the Old Bailey. The trial lasted 3 days. A plea of insanity was rejected. The brevity of the trial was presumably related to the necessity of preventing any untoward disclosures. As is customary with the type of political assassination, the, quote, lone assassin, end quote, theory has to be preserved at all costs. On May 18, 1812, Bellingham was hanged. A few weeks later, after Percival's murder, the orders in council forbidding neutral nations trading with France were revoked. In the United States House of Representatives, Henry Clay, who was a Freemason, led a group of young Democratic Republicans known as the War Hawks. The vote to declare war was decided on June 1st, 1812 by 79 votes to 49, with all 39 Federalists refusing to support it. In the Senate, the vote was decided by 19 to 13 votes, as there was no unanimity. Critics frequently referred to it as Mr. Madison's War. In England, Percival's successor, Lord Robert Liverpool, was an enthusiastic supporter of the war. However, neither belligerent was able to achieve its objectives, except Nathan Rothschild, who realized his aim of setting up the Second Bank of the United States on April 10, 1816. When hostilities ceased over 2 years later, on August 24, 1814, over 24,000 lives had been lost. The war was very costly to the United States in financial terms. It incurred a huge war debt of $105 million relative to its population of 8 million. As a result thereof, the national debt increased by 182%, with $45 million in 1812 to $127 million in 1815. Peace was signed in Ghent, Belgium on December 24, 1814. The Second Bank of the United States had an enlarged capital of $35 million. The bank immediately established a large number of branch banks to lend fiat money at composed rates of interest. In 1822, President James Monroe appointed Nicholas Biddle president of the bank. Biddle had first made contact with the Rothschilds while on government business in Paris in 1804. While acting as secretary to the United States Minister of France, John Armstrong, as president of the bank, he acted as pointman to James de Rothschild, who was the bank's principal investor. The artificially induced recession of 1819 through 21, which was very profitable for the bankers who were able to buy up assets at depressed prices, convinced the leaders of the Democrats, Andrew Jackson, that the only way to terminate these abuses was to close down the central bank. In his re-election campaign in 1832, he declared that, quote, "the monster must perish," end quote, and his chief slogan was, quote, "vote Andrew Jackson, no bank," end quote. He stated that, quote, "if Congress has the right under the Constitution to issue paper money, it was given to them to be used by themselves, not to be delegated to individuals or corporations," end quote. He also said that, quote, "if the American people only understood the rank injustice of our banking and money system, there would be a revolution before morning," end quote. Notwithstanding a failed assassination attempt on January 30th, 1835, when the 20-year charter of the Second Bank of the United States came up for renewal in 1836, Jackson collapsed the bank by withdrawing all government deposits. He promptly repaid the national debt in its entirety, leaving a surplus of $50 million in the Treasury. The central bank was replaced by an independent treasury system based on the redeemable paper and specie. During President John Tyler's term of office from 1841 through 1845, 2 attempts were made by Congress under the sponsorship of the former Speaker of the House of Representatives, Henry Clay, to renew the charter of the Bank of the United States. Clay, who had in 1820 become Grand Master of the Kentucky Lodge, was another agent deemed to be under the influence of the Rothschilds. Tyler vetoed both of these bills and was subsequently inundated with hundreds of letters threatening him with assassination. For the next 77 years, the United States developed without the need of a central bank. Its means of exchange were funded primarily by debt and interest-free Treasury greenback dollar bills, first issued by President Abraham Lincoln in 1862 in order to finance his military expenditure during the Civil War, and gold and silver coins. Up to 1873, gold and silver could be coined at any U.S. mint free of charge. After having rejected offers by private bankers to lend money to the United States government at interest rates varying between 24% and 36% per annum, Lincoln had, on the advice of his friend Colonial Dick Taylor, issued $347 million currency at no cost to the American people except for the expense of printing and distribution. The American Civil War, 1861 through 1865, left the U.S. government with a war debt of $5 billion. As a result of inflation, these bonds had declined in value to $2.5 billion. Large quantities of these bonds were bought up by the Rothschild's agent, Auguste Belmont, in the hope of realizing them at their face value in gold. In the 1868 presidential election, the Democratic Party candidate George H. Pendleton pledged payment only in paper. He was soon replaced by Horatio Seymour on the initiative of Belmont, who had assumed chairmanship of the Democratic National Committee in 1860. Seymour promised payment in specie. However, when the convention passed a resolution in favor of paper, Belmont was forced to switch sides and thereafter secretly supported the Republican candidate General Ulysses S. Grant and used his part ownership of the New York World newspaper in order to denigrate and undermine the chances of Seymour. Grant won, and on assuming office in 1869, he promptly introduced the Public Credit Act, which paid out the face value of the $5 billion worth of bonds in gold. This resulted in the Rothschilds and their associates making a 100% profit. The silver exchange was abolished and replaced by a gold standard by means of an act revising and amending the laws relative to the mints. Assay offices and the coinage of the United States. On January 17, 1873, this act was passed by the Senate. According to a sworn affidavit of Mr. Frederick A. Luckenbach, dated May 9, 1892, he had learned that Mr. Ernest Said in London that the denominations of American silver and had been expressly ordered by the governors of the Bank of England, who had furthermore paid £100,000 or $500,000 in order to have a sufficient number of committee members of the U.S. Congress dealing with financial matters bribed. This nefarious deed became known as the Crime of 1873. The forced abandonment of the people's money, silver, was also instituted in the German Empire when the government explicitly ceased to mint silver thaler coins in 1871. There seems to be little doubt that this was part of a synchronized scheme coordinated by the private bankers in order to further entrench the gold standard. The gold standard wrought havoc on the American economy and enabled private bankers to withhold loans and restrict the money supply at will. There followed a series of unnatural created panics or bank runs in 1873, 1884, 1890 through 1891, 1893 through 1894, 1897, 1903, and 1907. These artificially created bank runs so incensed President James Abram Garfield that shortly after he took office on March 4, 1881, he issued a statement in the middle of June of that year that he intended to master the problem when he said the following, quote, "Whosoever controls the volume of money in any country is absolute master of all industry and commerce. And when you realize that the entire system is very easily controlled, one way or another, by a few powerful men at the top, you will not have to be told how periods of inflation and depression originate." End quote. 2 weeks later, Garfield was gunned down by a lone assassin, Charles J. Guiteau, who had a grievance for not having received a diplomatic posting. Garfield did not die immediately, but as a result of improper medical care, lingered on until his death on September 19, 1881. At his trial, Guiteau claimed that, quote, "important men in Europe put him up to the task and had promised to protect him if he were ever caught." End quote. The 1907 panic had the worst effects. In early 1907, Jacob Schiff, CEO of Kuhn, Loeb & Co., warned that, quote, "unless we have a central bank with adequate control of credit resources, this country is going to undergo the most severe and far-reaching money panic in history." End quote. In October of that year, J.P. Morgan set the panic in motion by circulating rumors that its rival, the Knickerbocker Bank and Trust Co., was insolvent. In the ensuing crash, shares listed on the New York Stock Exchange lost 50% of their value. Further consequences of this deliberately induced panic were a 11% drop in industrial production the following year, a 26% rise in imports, and an increase in unemployment from under 3% to 8%. It was these continental phases of artificially created boom and bust, inflation and deflation, which provided the motivation and pretext to set up a central bank, which would allegedly solve all the seemingly never-ending problems for all time. Establishment of the United States Federal Reserve Bank. In order to mislead the public, two alternative plans were proposed. One was advanced by the National Monetary Commission under the leadership of Senator Nelson Aldrich, grandfather of Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller, and known as the Aldrich Plan. The other plan, adopted by the Special Currency Committee of the New York Chamber of Commerce, was under the chairmanship of Paul Warburg, a German banker who was acting on behalf of the Rothschild interest headed by Baron Alfred Rothschild. It was known as the Wall Street Plan. Except for the distribution of reserves, both plans were identical and had as their aim the establishment of a central reserve bank. On November 22, 1910, the banking conspirators, including among others A. Piatt Andrew, Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, Frank Vanderlip, President of the National City Bank of New York, Henry P. Davidson, Senior Partner, J.P. Morgan and Company, Charles D. Norton, President, First National Bank of New York, Benjamin Strong, Vice President Bankers Trust of New York, and Paul Moritz Warburg, Partner, Kuhn, Loeb and Company, sneaked out of New York in Aldrich's Pullman car, with all its blinds drawn. From Hoboken, New Jersey railway station to Jekyll Island, Georgia. At the very exclusive Jekyll Island Hunt Club owned by J.P. Morgan, the fate of the American people and indeed the world would be determined over the next 10 days by this group of financiers who were also known as the First Name Club. Only first names were used so as to not reveal their identities to the staff. The bill to establish the United States Federal Reserve Bank was vehemently opposed by Congressman Charles August Lindbergh, who said that, quote, "This act establishes the most gigantic trust on earth, such as the Sherman Antitrust Act, would dissolve if Congress did not by this act expressly create what by that act is prohibited. When the President signs this act, the invincible government by the money power, proven to exist by the Pujo Money Trust investigation, will be legalized. The greatest crime of Congress is its currency system, the schemist legislative crime of all ages is perpetuated by this new banking and currency bill." End quote. The bill was also bitterly opposed in the Senate, with Senator Robert M. Lafolte being one of the most vociferous opponents. It was passed into law on December 23, 1913, after the members of the Senate had been threatened by the thoroughly disreputable President Woodrow Wilson, quote, "who was as devoid of ethics and principle as he was of morality," end quote, that he would keep them in session until it had passed the bill and deny them their Christmas recess. Only a minority of 43 senators supported the bill, with 25 voting against it, 27 refusing to vote, and 5 members absent. The promoters of the bill promised that the United States dollar would become a stable currency and that business cycles and recessions would become a thing of the past. In the event since the inception of the U.S. Federal Reserve Bank in 1914, the U.S. dollar has lost 97% of its purchasing power, and there have been 19 recessions. The Great Depression of the 1930s and the current Great Recession, which started in 2008, and notwithstanding mainstream media propaganda to the contrary, appears to have all the symptoms of a depression. Since 1910, the national debt has increased from $2.65 billion to $20 trillion in March of 2017, while unfunded liabilities such as the Social Security, Medicare, and benefits for military veterans exceeded $240 trillion. The United States Federal Reserve Bank, instead of functioning as the people's bankers of the bankers, has operated solely as a private bank for the benefit of private bankers. It comes as no surprise that in its 104 years of existence, its accounts have never been submitted to public audit. The following are the bank's principal shareholders: Rothschild Banks of London and Berlin, Lazard Brothers Banks of Paris, Israel Moses Saif Banks of Italy, Warburg Bank of Hamburg and Amsterdam, Shearson American Express, Goldman Sachs of New York, J.P. Morgan Chase Bank. The State Bank of the Russian Empire. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, a different system of finance, viz. State banking, had been adopted. From September 1814 to June 1815, the Congress of Vienna was held in order to settle the issues arising from the French Revolutionary Wars, the Napoleonic Wars, and the discussion of the Holy Roman Empire. Behind the scenes, Nathan Mayer Rothschild proposed the formation of a New World Order concentrated around central banking. All the major powers, with the exception of Russia, were indebted to the Rothschild banks. Tsar Alexander I, 1801 through 25, refused to comply with Rothschild's devious scheme and derailed it. Instead, he established the Holy Alliance between Austria, Prussia, and Russia, which was signed on September 26, 1815, by Emperor Francis I of Austria, King Friedrich Wilhelm III of Prussia, and Tsar Alexander. He also rejected Rothschild's offer to set up a central bank in Russia. Whether it was because he distrusted him or was aware of the perils of central banking is not known, but he wisely declined. However, his prudent behavior incurred the vindictive and unrelenting wrath of the Rothschilds, who, according to Major General Count Cherep Spidhovek, were responsible for the assassination of the last 5 czars and would seek and obtain their vengeance in spectacular fashion of 102 years later. On June 12, 1860, the State Bank of the Russian Empire was founded with the aim of boosting trade turnovers and the strengthening of the monetary system. Up to 1894, it was an auxiliary institution under the direct control of the Ministry of Finance. In that year, it was transformed into being the banker of the bankers and operated as an instrument of government policy. It minted and printed the nation's coins and notes, regulated the money supply, and through the commercial banks provided industry and commerce with low interest rate loans. Its vast gold reserves, the largest in the world, exceeded the banknote issue by more than 100%, except for the year 1906. By 1914, it had become one of the most influential lending institutions in Europe. Not expectantly, Russia had the smallest national debt in the world. The following table reflects the number of rubles of debt per inhabitant. France 288, Great Britain 169, Germany 135, Russia 58. By 1914, 83% of the interest and amortization of the national debt, of which less than 2% was held abroad, was funded by the profits of the Russian state railways. In 1916, the total length of the main lines was 100,817 verst, or kilometers. Russian commercial and canal tonnage of 11,130,000 in 1910 exceeded British merchant tonnage of 10,750,000. In 1861, Tsar Alexander II, from 1855 through 81, abolished serfdom, which at that time affected 30% of the population. By 1914, very little land remained in the possession of the Russian state owners, who were mainly the nobility. 80% of the arable land was in the hands of the peasants, which had been ceded to them for a very small sum. This land was held in trust by the village commune, or mer. However, after the passing of the Stolypin Act in 1906, peasants could obtain individual title with hereditary rights. By 1913, 2 million families had availed themselves of this opportunity to acquire what became known as the Stolypin farms. Nearly 19 million acres, or 7,689.27 hectares, were allotted to these individual peasant proprietors by the land committees. The Peasants' State Bank, which was described at the time as the, quote, greatest and most socially beneficent institution of land credit in the world, end quote, granted loans at a low rate of interest, which was in effect a handling charge. Agricultural production soared so that by 1913, Russia had become the world's bread basket, as the following table reveals. Let's see, how do I want to do this? Okay, we'll just start with the world production. Barley, 1,771. Oats, 3,324. Rye, 2,378. Wheat, 4,971. Russian production. For their barley, it was 750. Oats, 1,087. Rye, 1,593. Wheat, 1,554. So the percentage of the barley compared to the world production was 42%, oats 30%, rye 67%, wheat 31%. Russian agricultural production of cereals exceeded the combined production of Argentina, Canada, and the United States by 25%. In 1913, Russia had 37.5 million horses, more than half of all these in the world. She also produced 80% of the world's flax and provided more than 50% of the world's egg imports. Mining and industrial output also expanded by huge margins. Between 1885 and 1913, coal production increased from 259.6 million poods to 2,159.8 million poods. Cast iron production rose from 25 million poods in 1890 to 1,378 million poods in 1913, and petroleum production rose from 491.2 million poods in 1906 to 602.1 million poods in 1916. From 1870 to 1914, industrial output grew by 1% per annum in Great Britain, 2.75% per annum in the United States, and 3.5% annum in Russia. During the period from 1890 to 1913, industrial production quadrupled, and Russian industries were able to satisfy 80% of the internal demand for manufactured goods, a perfect example of autarky. Throughout the last 20% of peacetime imperial rule 1895 through 1914, the increase in gross domestic product averaged 10% per annum, with the Russian state bank creating the people's money out of nothing at almost zero interest, as opposed to the rest of the world where central banks allowed parasitic private banks to create their nation's money supply as usurious rates of interest. It comes as to no surprise to find out that in 1912, Russia had the lowest levels of taxation in the world. These very low rates of taxation also attest to the efficiency of the Russian government. Furthermore, throughout this period of state banking, there was no inflation and no unemployment. So here's the table that they're showing me. Direct taxes in rubles per inhabitant. So for state taxes, the percentage from Great Britain was 10%, Germany 5.45%, France 6.44%, Austria 5.12%, Russia 1.28%. Now for local taxes, Great Britain had 16.74%, Germany 7.52%, France 5.91%, Austria 5.07%, Russia only 1.38%. So in total, the percentage for Great Britain on both state and local taxes was 26.75%, Germany 12.97%, France 12.35%, Austria 10.19%, and Russia 2.66%. Wow. Also, for indirect taxes in rubles per inhabitant, here's another table. State taxes percentage for Great Britain 13.86%, Germany 9.31%, France 13.11%, Austria 9.9%, Russia 5.95%. For local taxes percentage, for Great Britain doesn't show anything. Germany 0.33%, France 2.89%, Austria 1.38%, Russia 0.03%. So for the total percentage of state and local taxes for the indirect taxes in rubles per inhabitant, we have Great Britain at 13.86%, Germany 9.64%, France 16%, Austria 11.28%, and Russia at 5.98%. Between 1897 and 1913, state receipts rose from 1.4 million gold rubles to 3.471 million gold rubles. By 1914, the surplus on the budget account was 512 million gold rubles, and there was no increase in taxation. Throughout this same period, the foreign trade balance between exports and imports was in surplus. An indication of the financial health of the Russian economy can be gauged from the following comparative tables of gold reserves. The gold reserves and banknotes are expressed in millions of rubles. The gold reserves and banknotes are expressed in millions of rubles. So here's the table of the gold reserves. So for the gold column, we have the State Bank and the Russian Empire, 1,550. Banque de France, the central bank, 1,193. The Reichsbank, central bank, 411. Bank of England, central bank, 331. So instead of gold, we have banknotes over here. The State Bank of the Russian Empire was 1,494. Banque de France, central bank, 2,196. Reichsbank, central bank, 930. Bank of England, central bank, 263. An independent study of British lawyers concluded that the Russian Code of Laws and judiciary were, quote, the most advanced and impartial in the world, end quote. Elementary education was obligatory and free right up to university level, where only nominal fees were charged. Between 1906 and 1914, 10,000 schools were opened annually. Russian universities were renowned for their high academic standards. In labor relations of Russians were pioneers. Child labor was abolished over 100 years before it was abolished in Great Britain in 1867. Russia was the first industrialized country to pass laws limiting the hours of work in factories and mines. Strikes, which were forbidden in the Soviet Union, were permitted and minimal in Tsarist times. Trade union rights were recognized in 1906, while an inspectorate of labor strictly controlled working conditions in factories. In 1912, social insurance was introduced. Labor laws were so advanced and humane that President William Taft of the United States was moved to say that, quote, the Emperor of Russia has passed workers' legislation which was nearer to perfection than that of any democratic country, end quote. The people of all races in the Russian Empire had an equality of status and opportunity which was unparalleled in the modern world. His Imperial Majesty Tsar Nicholas II, 1868 through 1917, and his state bank had created a workers' paradise that was unrivaled in the history of mankind. On November 17, 1917, the Rothschilds fearful that replication of this extraordinary example of freedom and prosperity would destroy their malevolent banking empire, instigated and financed by the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, which wrecked and ruined a wonderful country and resulted in the deaths of by murder and starvation, according to Alexander Solzhenitsyn, of 66 million innocent people. The creation and control of the Soviet Union. In Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, author Professor Antony Sutton, with the assistance of State Department documents and personal papers of American international bankers, details the, quote, enthusiastic alliance of Wall Street and Marxist socialism, end quote. Without the financial support of J.P. Morgan's Guarantee Trust Company, John D. Rockefeller's Chase National Bank, Jacobs Schiff's Kuhn Loeb and Company, and Ulf Aschberg of the Swedish Nya Banken, the Bolshevik Revolution would not have succeeded. Of more particular interest in the financing of the revolution is the role which Maxim Litvonen, 1876 through 1951, who was born Mayor Janok Moshjosis Wallach Finkelstein, played as a revolutionary in destroying Imperial Russia and handing it over to the international bankers. Litvinov commenced his revolutionary career in 1898. In 1901, he was arrested and spent 18 months in prison, from which he escaped. In 1903, he was entrusted with money, which was used to finance and distribute the newspaper of the Russian Socialist Democratic Party, Iskra, which was printed in London. In 1905, Litvinov received further funds from friends from abroad, which enabled the purchase of arms, again in London. Thereafter, Litvinov was known as Papasha, or Daddy, became the source of all foreign funds and was appointed treasurer of the party, a decision which Lenin could not overrule because Litvinov was a representative of the Rothschilds, with powers exceeding those of Lenin. Lenin was merely informed of the decision. A few months later, at a meeting in Geneva, Litvinov was elected Secretary of Foreign Transport Groups. Lenin was again informed of this decision. Litvinov was never a genuine revolutionary, but instead used Bolshevism as a disguise in order to advance the aims of his master agenda. From 1908 through 1918, Litvinov resided in London with the assistance of his English friends. During this period, he held a variety of occupations, working for a publishing house, Williams and Norgate, a tourist agency, and selling farm machinery. Presumably, these occupations provided a suitable cover for his clandestine activities. In 1914, at the outbreak of World War I, the Russian government demanded that all its citizens be returned to Russia in order to serve in the army. However, the British authorities allowed Litvinov to remain. In 1916, Litvinov married a daughter of one of the most distinguished Jewish families in England, Ivy Lau. On January 3, 1918, Litvinov was appointed as the authorized representative of Soviet Russia. One of his first tasks was to demand that the money held at the Bank of England on behalf of the Tsarist embassy be handed over to him. The bank duly complied. In September 1918, a conspiracy against the Bolsheviks involving British ambassador Robert Bruce Lockhart was exposed. Both Lockhart and Litvinov was arrested by their respective governments, and as a result of a subsequent exchange, Litvinov returned to Moscow. His new assignment was to, quote, secure fast outflow of gold and jewelry from Russia, end quote, via Scandinavia, under the cover of a scheme to purchase steam engines later known as, quote, gold engines, end quote. A quarter of Russia's gold reserves were transferred to Sweden for onward transshipment. On April 21st, 1921, Litvinov was appointed commissioner of the Council of People's Commissaries for currency transactions and sales of gold abroad. Quote, several hundred million rubles of our gold went through my hands and was sold abroad. I sold the majority of this gold directly or through various intermediaries to large French companies, which remetaled this gold either in France or Switzerland, and then this gold went to its final destination in storage at the American Reserve Bank. End quote. Rothschild's privately owned bank, Litvinov, had become the, quote, authorized representative of the bankers, owners of the FRB, the Bank of England and Soviet Russia. End quote. In December 1921, the Kuzbas Autonomous Industrial Colony was established. It handed over control of a vast industrial complex to a group of American and European investors who had assisted in financing it. Thereafter, quote, millions of gold rubles flowed abroad without any custom duties, allegedly, as interest for the capital invested by European bankers, end quote, despite the fact that the investments were not all that large. In 1924, Joseph Stalin became the leader of the Soviet Union, but Litvinov, who feared no one, remained preeminent. His rudeness to Stalin was legendary. In the purge of 1937 through 1938, nearly all of Litvinov's deputies were arrested and then shot. Litvinov pleaded for his life of one of his closest friends, Boris Stomenyakov, and informed Stalin that he could vouch for him. Stalin looked Litvinov in the eyes and replied, quote, comrade Litvinov, you can only vouch for yourself, end quote. From 1930 through 1939, Litvinov was People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs of the Soviet Union. In 1939, relations between National Socialist Germany and Soviet Union started to thaw a little. This was an anathema to Litvinov's masters, who had nightmarish memories of the Holy Alliance struck between Austria, Prussia, and Russia in 1815, and Bismarck's Dreikaiserbund, Three Emperor League, concluded between the same three empires in 1872. Litvinov objected, but by the time Stalin had had enough of Litvinov's impudent behavior, on May 3, 1939, a quiet coup d'état took place and Stalin, quote, dismissed the puppet of the banking underworld from the position of foreign minister, end quote. With its own state bank of the USSR, or Gosbank, which was founded on November 16, 1921, the Soviet Union had finally gained its sovereignty and independence from the international bankers. All Litvinov's deputies and heads of departments were arrested, but he himself was spared, and he was untouchable. Litvinov was allowed to retire to his dacha, but was kept under constant surveillance. In late 1941, Litvinov's services were once again required. With the Germans banging on the gates of Moscow, Stalin's desperate situation necessitated urgent help from the West. Litvinov was sent to Washington as Soviet ambassador. The Americans were reluctant to lend money to the Soviet Union, but Litvinov soon sorted everything out. Within a few weeks, a loan of $1 billion was granted. A lend-lease agreement was signed, and over the next 4 years, $11 billion worth of supplies and services were provided. Litvinov, quote, could call the White House at any time, and the President Roosevelt would see him immediately, end quote. Both these stooges at the international bankers pumped gold, and one out of Russia, the other from people of the United States, into the vaults of the Federal Reserve Bank. Litvinov was recalled in 1943 when the war turned in Russia's favor. His successor as foreign minister, Vyacheslav Molotov, provides an apt epitaph, quote, Litvinov was utterly hostile to us. He deserved the highest measure of punishment at the hands of the proletariat. Every punishment." End quote. From July 1st through July 22nd, 1944, the international bankers organized a conference at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Its purpose was to establish a World Bank and an international monetary fund which would govern relations amongst independent nations and maintain fixed exchange rates. Soviet representatives attended the conference but refused to sign, stating that the proposed institutions were branches of Wall Street. Between July 17th and August 2nd, 1945, the Potsdam Conference was held in Germany. It determined the new borders of Europe. From this time, the Soviet Union was gradually frozen out, and the start of the Cold War commenced. Stalin had no designs on Western Europe. His armies was completely exhausted, and he had more than enough tasks on his hands in absorbing Eastern Europe under his hegemony and repairing all the damage to his country. From a military perspective, the dropping of nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki was unnecessary, as in January 1945, Japan was already trying to secure surrender terms. The Cold War was prosecuted, initially by the Western countries, in order to bring the Soviet Union to heel. Stalin, who was rather more of a nationalist than a communist, resisted and was allegedly poisoned, and then allowed to die from a massive stroke for which he did not receive any medical treatment. On March 1st, 1953, thereafter the Cold War degenerated into a farce, as the West, and in particular the United States, invested heavily in the Soviet Union. Huge investments were made at the Gorky plant, which built Ford trucks, and the largest automotive plant in the world at Volgograd, which manufactured Fiat cars. There were also substantial investments in aviation, computers, and electricity. The Soviet Union became an investment designation of choice. The Russians soldiered on, but with 50% of their budget being allocated to armaments. This was a war with which they could not win in the long term. This explains why living standards in the Soviet Union could never match those achieved in the West, notwithstanding the provision of free services such as education and housing. In 1991, the Soviet Union imploded and a swarm of advisors arrived from the USA, who introduced the wonders of unregulated free market capitalism, which included income tax and usury. The primary purpose of these advisors was, quote, to present the law on the Central Bank of Russia at the right moment, which hardly did less damage than a whole army of invaders in making Russia lose its sovereignty, end quote. For almost 200 years, the Tsars and Soviets resisted, but finally Russia fell entirely into the hands of the Rothschilds. The Anglo-Boer War. Throughout the 19th century, the world's monetary system was based on the gold standard, which had been developed and maintained by the Rothschilds. The discovery of the largest gold fields in the world on the Witwatersrand in the 1886 created a new source of supply, which had to be controlled if the dishonest financial system was to survive. Unfortunately for the Rothschilds, these new mines were located in the independent Zuid-Afrikaanse Republic. Streams of immigrants and speculators soon arrived in the country. Some of them were British, but a larger number consisted of, quote, Russians, Poles, and Germans with roving propensities and no strongly rooted attachment to an old country, end quote. The leading gold mining company was the Eckstein Group, named after its managing director, Hermann Eckstein. This combination included Consolidated Goldfields and S. Newman and Co. Professor John Addison Hobson writes in The War in the South Africa, Its Causes and Effects, that, quote, Rothschild had a controlling interest in Goetz and Co., end quote, and that, quote, Rothschild stands for the Exploration Company, which is in effect Werner, Bates, and Rothschild, end quote. By the early 1890s, the foreign workers and speculators had started to outnumber the Boers. In 1896, after the abortive Jameson Raid, which tried to overthrow the Transvaal government, the South African League was founded as a Rothschild front in order to agitate for the granting of voting rights to the Uitlanders, or foreign workers. In order to protect the status, the Boers would only grant the franchise after a period of 14 years of residence. On May 30th, 1899, at a conference held in Bloemfontein, the capital of the Orange Free State, President Paul Kruger offered to reduce the period of residence to 7 years. The British High Commissioner, Sir Alfred Milner, was unmoved and held to his point of view that it was reform or war. Eventually, Kruger, quote, bowing his head between his big red hands, hot tears streaming down his bearded cheeks, end quote, cried out in anguish, quote, "It is my country that you want," end quote. In September 1899, in an act of provocation, the British started to mass troops to the southern Transvaal border. A request on October 9th, 1899, that Her Majesty's government cease, quote, the constant bringing up of troops to the borders of the Republic and the sending of reinforcements from all ports of the British Empire, was ignored. 2 days later, war broke out. Although the Boers had only a part-time army of mounted horsemen, they enjoyed stunning successes in the initial phases of the war. However, they were ultimately outgunned, outnumbered, and in some instances poorly fed. From June 1900 onwards, the Boers resorted to guerrilla warfare. A tiny force of never more than 6,000 active Boers was able to frustrate and tie down almost 450,000 troops of the world's largest empire. Peace was signed at Vereeniging on May 31st, 1902. The war had been an unmitigated disaster for the Boers. In contravention of the Hague Convention of July 29, 1899, which bound Great Britain to observe its, quotes, rules of civilized warfare, end quote, an unprecedented scorched earth policy was introduced. The Boers' homestead were razed to the ground, wells were poisoned, their cattle were slaughtered, and their women were raped. 25 towns and their contents and 20 villages, including all their churches, were destroyed. 155,000 women and children were herded into 46 concentration camps and housed in tents, where in some camps during winter temperatures fell below zero. 34,000 of them died of malnutrition, poor sanitation, and exposure, of whom 81% were under the age of 16. The British also suffered high losses, with 21,942 being killed, 35% in battle, 65% from disease, and 22,829 were being wounded. The bankers had the satisfaction of obtaining full control of the gold and other mineral resources of South Africa, of financing the war in the amount of £222 million, and thereby adding a further £132 million to Britain's national debt. For Nathan, Alfred, and Leopold Rothschild, the Anglo-Boer War was a consummate victory. The Commonwealth Bank of Australia. The Commonwealth Bank of Australia was inspired by King O'Malley, an American who found out the secrets of fractional reserve banking while working for his uncle's bank in New York in the 1880s. When the bank's first governor, Sir Denison Miller, was asked where he proposed obtaining capital for his bank, he replied, quote, "What capital? I don't need any capital. My capital is the entire wealth and credit of the whole of Australia," end quote. With an advance of £10,000 from government, which was quickly repaid, the Commonwealth Bank of Australia was founded on July 15, 1912. Although established as a private bank, it operated as a state bank with the power to carry on all business generally transacted by banks, including that of a savings bank. Furthermore, the bank was entitled to raise capital through the sale of debentures secured by the national credit. Its profits were equally divided into two funds. a reserve fund to meet any liabilities incurred by the bank, and a redemption fund to redeem debtors or other stock issued by the bank. Thereafter, 50% of its profits were allocated for the liquidation of the national debt. For the next 12 years, notwithstanding the years of World War I from 1914 through 18, Australia enjoyed one of its greatest eras of prosperity. By providing government loans at a nominal rate of interest, viz. 2/3 of 1 per centum per annum, it enabled the country to embark on a huge infrastructure program. It included provision of a $18.72 million for the construction of dams and Murrumbidgee irrigation system, the Great Transcontinental Railroad, electricity power plants, gasworks, harbors, roads, and tramways. In addition, the fruit, wheat, and wool crops of farmers were financed for an amount of $3 million at nominal rates of interest. It made available a $4 million to purchase 15 cargo steamers in order to transport Australia's growing exports, and $8 million were allocated to subsidies housing. World War I cost Australia $700 million, but it was financed by the bank as a non-interest bearing debt. This phenomenal period of prosperity was terminated in 1924 when a bill which placed control of the bank in the hands of a directorate consisting of a governor, the secretary to the treasury, and 6 persons actively engaged in agriculture, finance, and industry for different terms of years, was introduced by Stanley Melbourne Bruce, Prime Minister from 1924 through 29, and Dr. Earl Page, his coalition partner. There is a suspicion that Bruce may have been bribed, as what he did was completely against the best interest of the Australian people. During his term of office, the Australian government borrowed £230 million from the City of London, and by 1927, the federal and state debt had reached £1 billion, and the budget was in deficit. On October 10, 1924, the bill was proclaimed as an act. The subsequent effect of this act was to place the bank under the control of a body of men, who later deprived it of the right to create the nation's money supply of free debt and interest. In 1927, the bank lost its savings bank subsidiaries, and although it was permitted to continue issuing banknotes and thereby earn a modicum of seigniorage, it thereafter became a central bank operating exclusively for the benefit of private banks. The final betrayal of the bank occurred on March 20th, 1947, when the House of Representatives voted by 55 to 5 votes for it to become a member of the International Monetary Fund, and thus subject to the decrees and dictates of the Rothschilds' controlled Bank for International Settlements. World War I. World War I started on June 28, 1914, when Gavrilo Princip, a member of a terrorist group, the Black Hand, assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austrian throne, and his Czech-born wife at Sarajevo, Bosnia-Herzegovina. Princip and a collector of Leon Trotsky, real name Lev David Bronstein, who was conspiring with Vladimir Lenin to overthrow the Russian monarchy. He was in turn financed by an American banker, Jacob Schiff, who was a frontman for Lord Nathan Rothschild, who was one of the masterminds behind this appalling catastrophe. These facts were confirmed in the United States Senate in 1921, when it was recorded that, quote, full responsibility for the First World War lies on the shoulders of the international bankers. They are responsible for millions of dead and dying, end quote. In late October 1926, further confirmation of these incontrovertible facts was revealed in a conversation between British parliamentarian Victor H. Cazalet and Henry Ford from 1863 through 1947. When the former asked who the international financiers were, Ford replied, quote, I have several books which will tell you who they all are. They were responsible for the last war and will in the future always be capable of creating a war when they feel their pockets need one. End quote. Trade, rivalry, competing alliances, and misunderstood mobilizations are often proffered as being the primary causes of World War I. However, the real reasons were to destroy the Russian Empire and its state bank, and break up the other empires, Austro-Hungarian, German, and Ottoman, into smaller states, which could then be exploited more efficiently through the establishment of central banks. By the end of 1916, the British and French armies were in danger of losing the war, with the latter army having already mutinied on the Western Front. The British had lost their naval supremacy at the Battle of Jutland on May 3, 1916, when the German Navy, outnumbered by 2-1, humiliated the invincible Royal Navy, sinking 12 vessels for the loss of 6, and losing 2,551 sailors compared to the British loss of 6,094. Both Kaisers were desperate to bring an end to this fractional and pointless slaughter. Seemingly out of the blue came an offer from Lord Rothschild to secure American intervention in return for handing over Palestine to a group of Zionists after the liquidation of the Ottoman Empire. On April 6, 1917, the United States declared war on Germany and other Central Powers, and on November 2, 1917, Lord Rothschild and his Zionist collaborators received their written undertaking by Great Britain to eventually hand over Palestine to Jewish settlers. This infamous document, known as the Balfour Declaration, was drafted by Lord Arthur James Balfour. British Foreign Secretary and General Jan Christian Smuts, a member of the Imperial War Cabinet, the misery of the unnecessary war dragged on for another 2 years. Russia was totally destroyed, and an insoluble problem was created in the Middle East. Guttel Schnapper, Mayor Armschell's Rothschild's wife, is reputed to have said shortly before she died in 1849, quote, "If my sons did not want war, there would have been none." End quote. An armistice was declared on November 11, 1918, and 7 months later, on June 28, 1919, the deeply flawed Treaty of Versailles was signed. Germany had to accept exclusive blame and pay extortionate reparations of £6.6 billion, equivalent to the entire wealth of the country, even though the other principal belligerents, England, France, and Russia, were equally, if not just as blameworthy. This indemnity would be used to repay the international bankers the fraudulent loans and interest which had been previously lent to the governments of Great Britain and France. As General Smuts said at the conference, quote, "Everything we have done here is far worse than the Congress of Vienna. The statesmen of 1815 at least knew what was going on. Our statesmen have no idea." End quote. And with that, I will see you guys all in the next video. Thank you.